Hello, I know it's been a couple months since I made my last video, and it's probably been a couple years since I've appeared on a video, but I'm kind of in shock. Um, I just made a Facebook post last week, and I had been working on it since July, but it was about losing my job and a whole lot of other things. So I just lost my job. Over the past almost 8 years, I have been working for Communication Service for the Deaf, which relays calls for the deaf and hard of hearing. CSD had two divisions, one called Relay, where agents read the words of deaf callers and then typed the hearing person's response. And the other was called CapTel, where agents revoice what the hearing person says while voice recognition software records the words on screen. I started out in Relay in November 2014, but switched to CapTel the following August. Although one would think, given my typing acumen, that I would be better suited for the Relay job, I really struggled interacting with the callers, and I think I really deeply empathized with the deaf callers to a greater degree than a lot of other people did. I had a temper tantrum live on a call on behalf of a client who kept getting hung up on by some business because I had to repeatedly read through a spiel asking the caller if he had received a Relay call before, and the business that the person was calling didn't want to hear it. On that day I received a final warning, and I was deeply concerned I was going to be fired. We had to take a typing test and a spelling and grammar test before being trained initially. You'd think, given that I'm a typing champion and a spelling bee champion, that it would be second nature to me, but I just didn't feel like I had the social skills to handle belligerent callers. At that point I switched to the CapTel division. The warning cleared off after a year and I was fine. I worked all through the COVID lockdowns. Some days my mom had to drive me when the buses weren't running, but I did frequently take buses after our car broke down 2 years ago. I've never been able to afford to get it replaced. Eventually, starting in December 2020, I was able to work from home. About a year ago, CapTel introduced a method where on some calls, an increasingly growing number of calls over time, the software would do the voice recognition work by itself while the agent was now essentially a warm body, just editing errors in the captions. The automated system was never as good as the human captionists were, but it should have been obvious to me sooner than it was that the human workers would become completely expendable. A month or two ago, it was announced that full-time employees whose hours had already been reduced to 30 hours a week would have their hours again reduced to 24 hours a week, starting on July 23rd. Although I'm sure most people would have told me I should have had a more professional job than this, I was fine plugging away at this job because CSD employees were eligible for public service loan forgiveness. I owe well over $100,000 to Cornell, but I know that that would be wiped away after 10 years even if I was unable to pay for it. Sure, I may have now just received $20,000 in Biden bucks since I had a Pell Grant, and I'll go for it, but that does nothing to resolve my situation. However, once my hours were reduced, I was no longer eligible for public service loan forgiveness, and I also lost my health insurance. I started snooping around shortly thereafter and found out that some of the CapTel centers in the other regions of the country were closing. I figured that the Syracuse Center was going to close very soon, and I decided I wanted to transfer to Relay while I still could. Sure enough, it was announced that the CapTel Center closed on August 31st, and my last day was a week ago Monday. A couple weeks ago, I had a Zoom video interview with the Relay supervisors, and I expressed interest in returning to Relay. The odds were really looking good since there were only about 12 CapTel employees left, as many had already left, and I was just told a week ago Monday that only 2 of the current CapTel employees were applying to stay at Relay, and she expected that I would start training the week of September 12th. I had already passed the typing test last week, and it seemed like my return to Relay was going to be a formality and a sure thing. However, I had given an interview where I expressed concern about returning to Relay because of the earlier incident, and apparently I said something about a belligerent caller. I don't even remember this, and I'm not sure it happened, but I wasn't recording myself. I told them that I am way more mature now than I was in 2015, and I sincerely believe that. And honestly, even though I'm much physically weaker than I was then, I don't think I'd even have the energy to have a temper tantrum anymore if I wanted to. No, I didn't tell them that. Because I don't have a functioning car or really anyone in my life who would be willing to give me a ride, I would have to take a bus down to the center. The problem is that the buses don't run from the village of North Syracuse to downtown on weekends, and they couldn't guarantee that I wouldn't have to work unusual hours. There are also fewer bus lines now than there used to be before COVID. Still, I was going to try to make it work. I was committed. And then the bomb dropped. About a half hour before my final day of work ended, I was told they weren't going to retrain me. After they kept me on through the transition, I was fiercely loyal to them, working through the COVID years, and I was certainly going to stay at least through the 10 years I needed for public service loan forgiveness. But now it's been less than 8 years, including several months that were never properly certified, and I am unemployed. I had definitely grown complacent while at CSD because I had no intent to leave, so most of my previous skills are now rusty. I spent most of the time reading or writing between calls, and probably about half of what became my magnum opus, Nerds Per Minute, was written on the call floor between calls at work. But even though the book is really good and it was recently just mentioned in a New Yorker article, which came out a couple weeks ago, I've only sold about 180 copies. Despite my master's degree in applied statistics, I was never able to land any kind of professional stats job other than an extremely corrupt statistical contracting job during the Great Recession. I think my affiliation with that company blacklisted me from the stats industry for life. At this point, I've pretty much forgotten all of that training. I barely remember what an ANOVA is, for instance, and there would be no reason not to hire somebody 15 years younger with fresher knowledge. I knew a little database programming, and I still do, but I had never, even at my peak, mastered all the technologies one is expected to know for a programming job, and apart from a few SQL queries for my auto racing statistical research, I basically haven't programmed anything since I abandoned racedatabase.com at the end of 2015. I have in fact become increasingly anti-tech in the years since, realizing that the increasing glut of consumer tech products people are now expected to live with to survive is both ruining all real-world industries and, quite frankly, all human interaction in general. So there is some part of me that never wanted to personally contribute to developing anything that would lead people to further isolate from each other in daily life. Yes, I still spend almost all my free time online, but I'm old enough to understand that it isn't a good thing at least. I will not buy a smartphone. You can't make me. Even all my attempts to land any kind of typing job proved fruitless and futile, even when I was the best typist in the world, supposedly. I realized that a lot of that was probably my social ineptitude and autism. I'd have had a much better chance of landing one of those kinds of jobs if I had half the typing speed and twice the social skills. Not to mention that all those kinds of jobs are projected to decline 20 to 30% over the next decade, and they probably are basically not taking any new hires whatsoever. The first thing anyone will see forevermore upon Googling my name will be that stinking typing contest wherein my social ineptitude was publicly on display for a mass audience, which would then lead any employer to decide I was too weird for corporate culture and too much damaged goods and not talented enough to be hired, while I'd still be considered overqualified to work in a store or something. There are so many people I was smarter than in grade school who outperformed me in real life by large margins. One of my high school classmates, who wasn't even in the gifted classes with us, got a math PhD when that was probably expected of me. Meanwhile, my mom is rapidly deteriorating health-wise, although she was badly affected by multiple sclerosis even before I was born. Now at age 74, she is showing signs of old age. Her vision is rapidly deteriorating and she's now struggling even to read. Her hands have also grown increasingly arthritic and she struggles to even open plastic bottles. She believes she has a urinary tract infection as she's been having to go to the bathroom almost hourly and peeing her pants a lot. I know I need to take over management of our house, but I've simultaneously become weaker myself, and also become kind of a brat. I was never good at organizing anything, particularly anything that had an odd shape and that didn't stack easily. This dates back to childhood when I frequently lost homework assignments in my desks at school that were already completed, just because my organizational skills were so sloppy. While I was very quick at learning most academic intellectual tasks in grade school, I was incompetent at learning skills for real life, whether that was showering enough, remembering to brush my teeth, time management, networking, socialization, tying my shoes, or learning how to ride or bike or drive, neither of which I've done. The temple of my glasses broke a few months ago, and every time I look straight down, they fall off my face. In true nerd fashion. Like so. I did schedule an appointment for a new pair of glasses on September 1st, but they didn't go through with the appointment because I had lost my health savings account card. I did just find it, but it was after I had already canceled, and since I was no longer insured at that time, even though I was still fully insured when I scheduled the appointment a couple of months ago, I'm going to have to wait for the health savings card to arrive and hope that I still have that money in it even though I'm no longer employed. The woman who let me go told me that I would still have access to my health savings account. I'm not entirely sure I believe her. And of course, I still haven't done anything to work on my eating disorder and learn how to eat real food, which has resulted in an exacerbation of my irritable bowel syndrome symptoms. One Monday, I had to spend $60 to take a cab both ways to go to the office because my work from home computer wasn't working. I had some of the worst diarrhea of my life, having to go 5 times, farting out poop, and soiling 2 different pair of underwear, and wiping so hard I wiped a lot of blood in with my poop, and it's far from the first time that's happened over the years. It happened today even. I have lots of rib pain that I think is from gas, but it scares me and makes me think the worst every time. I've recently learned there are a couple of pretentious, yuppie, psychobabble buzzwords for the inability to handle menial lifestyle tasks, even if one is extremely proficient at other things that have much less importance in life, such as typing. Interoception and poor executive functioning are apparently the professional terms for this, and they are both strongly linked with autism. I'm worried that I'm going to be too sick to work at some point in the very near future. I definitely don't know that I could have worked today, which makes it even less likely that any employer would want to take a chance on me at this point, especially since I'm considered damaged goods and am rusty on my past technical knowledge. I tried to see my family doctor from childhood a few weeks ago to get a diagnosis for ARFID, the eating disorder I know I have. If you saw that video, I talked about it there. And to see if he could connect me to a nutritionist. He just told me nobody ever works out their eating issues and prescribed me drugs instead. I feel everyone in every aspect of my life is abandoning and or betraying me. What makes this even more perverse is that I'm still this niche celebrity who some people continue to find awe-inspiring. I've now been mentioned in 5 different major mainstream media platforms at this point. The New York Times, BBC, Slate, 538, and The New Yorker. It has done nothing to make me employable or happy. At least the New Yorker article got me a few book sales in the past couple weeks. Now that I've gone from being the person my classmates likely would have voted most likely to succeed if we'd voted on that like a cliched TV teen drama, but we didn't, to a washed-up gamer, I've decided to try to grow my YouTube channel because at this point that almost seems like a more tangible future than getting a steady job. Sure, you can say I was very successful at a bunch of things that didn't matter. I was the dominant typing gamer for about a decade. I wrote a good book. I attained an expert level tournament Scrabble rating, and I built what was at the time the 3rd largest auto racing database archive online and invented a lot of new auto racing statistics. It's not like I was just merely vegging out in front of the TV and smoking pot all day or anything, but for all the uber nerd freak show talents I did have, I never hit on anything an employer would care about. I have been trying to sell racedatabase.com, my auto racing archive, for some time, and I found a potentially interested buyer earlier this year, but he hasn't responded to my last emails. And of course, I recently noticed that my book has been torrented online, so probably very few people are going to buy it now. I really have made great strides on my YouTube channel, and my videos are way more professional. Not this one, but I learned a ton about video editing, although my audio editing and my narration clearly need work. Since I have almost 6,000 subscribers, there's definitely real potential here. However, the kind of videos I want to make nowadays aren't typing videos, and I know that you guys strongly prefer my typing videos to anything else, so even though I put way more effort into my new videos, they only seem to get a few hundred hits at most. After having previous months where I would gain as many as 200 subscribers, now that I've pivoted away from typing videos, I'm even losing subscribers some days. I mean, the month I uploaded that spelling bee video, I only got 10 subscribers, which was like my least in years. Now that I'm no longer the fastest typist, there isn't much interest anymore in me, as I'm now the washed up old fart, even though I still might be one of the top 10 type racer users if I ever wanted to go back there and compete, which I don't. And I can't seem to make anybody care about all of my other content. Simultaneously to making more elaborate YouTube videos, I built a statistical model ranking all the major league open wheel drivers from 1946 to the present. I've mentioned this here before several times, because I do still want to write a book ranking the top 1,000 drivers in motorsports history, but I know that would only sell 50 copies or something. I did finish that article after 7 months of research, and it was awesome. Typically almost no one cared. I did another article last week. I've just been in shock, and I haven't done much of anything, although I did organize a lot of the messes of paper, but there's still a lot to go. I realize I've been neglecting my mom when I should be taking charge of the house, and that and finding a job should be my main priority, but I am so overwhelmed and don't know where to begin with regards to anything. My mom grew up in dire rural poverty, having an outhouse and having to get water from a well and so on. Having lacked material possessions as a child, she valued material possessions as an adult and eventually became a hoarder. Having grown up with that, I never wanted to maintain a house with so much stuff, and have grown almost virulently anti-consumerist, and I dream of minimalism. As I myself grow sicker, I want to be less burdened by possessions and want to get rid of like 80% of them. Without access to a car or very many close local friends, I can't even think of a way. Our car broke down in 1920. Our car broke down in 2020. I don't know how to drive, and she is probably now too weak to drive. I thought when I returned to Syracuse it would be easy for me to rekindle connections from high school, since many of my classmates are still here, but I really haven't. All my friends are online now, and online friends generally can't help with real world material needs in any way except giving money. No, I'm not asking anyone to give me money. Like I mentioned in one of my recent videos, I was reading Robert Putnam's book Bowling Alone last year, and it shook me to the bones. It discussed the collapse of civic engagement in the last quarter of the 20th century in America. Even by the year 2000, Americans had largely stopped participating in any real-world communities and withdrew into private life. All metrics of community participation were down, whether it was voting, door-to-door campaigning, going to church, going to school board meetings, going to friends' houses, or even things as mundane as going on picnics, playing cards, or sending greeting cards. Interestingly, almost all these measures of civic engagement declined by about the same rate over that period, around 25 to 30% from the early 70s to the late 90s. These trends obviously accelerated in the wake of anti-social media, smartphones, and the COVID lockdowns. It's gotten to the point that even the watered-down, poor consumer facsimiles for community like malls and arcades are dying. One of the weird things I've noticed with regard to extremely online people is that they tend to have way more acquaintances than people did in the past, but fewer actual friends. It's never been easier to find social groups for people who share your interests. I have tons of people I could shoot the shit with online about typing, Scrabble, auto racing, even politics if I wanted to, but I have nobody close enough to help me with the major things I'm lacking in my life: my poor career outlook, my eating disorder, my decaying health, my deep and utter loneliness. And I know I'm not alone. This seems to be the modern condition. A lot of Americans seem to be fulfilled on the top tiers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, while lacking on the bottom tiers. The costs of housing, education, and healthcare may now be out of reach, but at least we traded that for a seemingly unlimited supply of consumer products. which no doubt was exactly what the elites wanted, because the more stuff we have to maintain, the more time we have to devote to maintaining the stuff and the less time we have to interact with other people. If we don't interact with other people, we can't possibly challenge the elites. Additionally, the more depressed and lonelier you become, the more susceptible you are to ad campaigns, which are needed to ensure supposedly eternal economic growth. Consume, consume, consume. We in general have more time to talk to people online, sure, but people online can't really help with other people's baseline needs, which are more local in nature. Right now, I feel like I'm too old for the online world and too young for the offline world. This must be a common situation for a lot of early millennials who didn't actually want to rebel. We grew up at the height of the family values era, where our earliest exposures to quote-unquote culture were things like TGIF sitcoms, Barney and Friends, Touched by an Angel, Chicken Soup for the Soul, and so on. The classrooms were bedecked with a never-ending supply of rhyming pseudo-inspirational aphorisms. If you believe you can achieve, drug-free's the way to be. Never lie, cheat, or steal, always strike a fair deal. Stranger danger, turn that frown upside down. And I bought into that kind of aggressively normie culture hardcore. I was just mentioning this on Michael Casalino's feed the other month, but I now see that there were two kinds of nerds. The normie nerds who were obsessed with performing at academics and wanted to please their teachers, and the gamer hacker nerds who were most obsessed with technical projects outside of school and resenting authority. We were all considered to be in the same group, and we were all social outcasts to varying degrees, but in retrospect these were two very different groups. Normie nerds like me, even though I was weirder than 99% of them, did not want to rebel against authority, strove to be teachers' pets, were usually very earnest, and used the mainstream internet platforms like AOL, GeoCities, and LiveJournal, while the gamer nerds erroneously believed performative irony was liberatory and sought out the edgier stuff like IRC, Newgrounds, Something Awful, 4chan, meme sites, cringe humor sites, etc. 20 years later, I can now see that the normie nerds effectively own mainstream culture. I believe in science, while the gamer nerds effectively own internet culture. F the normies. Unfortunately, as mainstream culture is discredited and everything online is destroying all the outposts of offline culture, all the neuroses of gamer nerds have started to take over the entire population, so that seemingly everybody now embraces irony, memes, the aesthetics of rebellion, the desire to shock and offend whoever your particular outgroup is, and cringe humor, all of which I think are generally bad. I am growing oh so sick of the default snarky style of internet humor that I feel I'm losing my sense of humor entirely, and indeed I think lots of people are starting to see me as a humorless sourpuss. Maybe it's true. As everybody spends more and more time online, even most conversations between genuine intellectuals now seem to consist of little more than a snarky inside joke in response to another snarky inside joke in response to another snarky inside joke, and I hate it. Maybe part of it is my autism and my wish that everybody would speak literally to remain understandable to each other, but a lot of it is something else. I understand why some people are into compulsory irony, because it can be psychologically comforting in the short run to behave that way. However, I believe irony breaks solidarity. When you are being ironic, what you are saying is, I only want to associate with the kinds of people smart enough to get my jokes. Piss off, normies. That is the very reason I'm starting to get sick of smart people and looking for people who are earnest, genuine, and kind. As bad and corny as the 90s mainstream family values culture was, I feel like we've replaced it with something far worse. Nobody has any positive vision of the future, and for good reason, as every American institution, probably every institution in general, has crumbled by bipartisan neglect. I imagine most younger typing gamers wouldn't even believe me if I told them that in the early 90s most people actually trusted the media. Since nobody has hope for the future, all anybody seems to want is to smite their enemies. It seems to me more and more that the only thing liberals want is the right to bully members of privileged demographic groups, while conservatives want the right to bully members of underprivileged demographic groups on anti-social media websites. Obviously the latter is worse than the former, but both are reprehensible. People in my age grew up in an era where were supposed to believe in zero tolerance for bullying, so I can't even fathom how that fell out of favor. Sometimes I feel like I was the only person who took my teachers seriously. On the other hand, I was and am a creature of the internet, so as much as I despise internet values and prefer the corny 90s establishment values that were overthrown apart from the bigotry, I don't even know how I would make human connections. I know I spent far too much of my time alone on the computer or compiling various statistics, but I also know enough about how other people used to live. People used to do things with other people. People used to call each other on the phone rather than texting. People used to go places. Even I, the loner nerd, had birthday parties, exchanged phone numbers with classmates, and so on. Now so much of this would be considered a security threat. Ever since 9/11, and especially since smartphones, people really started obsessing about security to an unhealthy degree, as if any individual person was likely to die in a terrorist attack in the first place, especially if they were too poor to hang out in the kind of high-profile venues where attacks would likely occur. I remember when it was considered normal for people in their daily lives to exchange phone numbers, and now it would be considered creepy or worse, doxing. I was so out of it culturally because I think most of this happened after I graduated college, and I felt badly out of the loop as an unemployed NEET. I find myself missing white pages because at least you could use them to cold call people or find ways to make connections to people who would have otherwise been out of your reach. And I'm old enough to remember that all that was considered normal. Everyone knew you could opt out of them, but most people didn't. But man, I despise cell phones. Once cell phones came in, since they were never listed in phone books, each user had complete control over who they gave their numbers to. If you happened to be completely out of someone's social circle, you'd have no chance of ever connecting with them in the first place. And if you were autistic and fell into isolation, you'd have no way to reconnect except through increasingly commercialized and increasingly nihilistic online sources. Granted, over the same period, younger people stopped talking on the phone anyway, for the most part, and started entirely texting. But it seems to me that when people did genuinely talk on the phone, they cared more about the important aspects of their daily lives. Phone conversations were deeper and more intimate than most of what social media is, merely taking pictures of things you did or worse, memes. Because texting has a limited character count, nobody can talk about anything of substance that way, and people have so many forced distractions in their lives anyway that they couldn't devote time to developing any intimate connections with anyone except maybe their spouse. And now I watch everybody, even people who weren't into technology when I was a kid, being addicted to phones, and I weep like a boomer because I know the people that have the deepest connections, the people who actually care most about the conditions of the lives of the people in their social networks, rather than merely having people to hang out with, are older people who regularly call their family and friends on landline phones. I will say that younger people do tend to care more about people in general, though, in the more abstract sense of humanity, so maybe it's a wash. I feel so frustrated because a lot of people idolize me as a typist while not caring about me as a person. Sure, I have all kinds of internet nerd prestige, glamour, and so on, but I am seriously lacking in a lot of more important human needs. I'm tired of gaming. I don't want to game anymore, whether it's Scrabble tournaments or typing games. I might enter the Ultimate Typing Championship this year if I think there's a shot of cashing, but I'm pretty sure there wouldn't be, since I think that they would only award prizes to the top two people, and check, Josh and Bailey would all beat me. I feel like I've been abandoned by so many of my former friends, but I guess I abandoned them as well, as every young person's connections are more distant than the deeper connections that older people seem to have. I certainly remember another early 90s classroom aphorism: if you want a friend, be a friend. I don't want to be a leech or a parasite. While I'm desperately seeking help in a lot of the important areas of my life, I also want to help other people in theirs. I've thought about someday maybe starting a Syracuse chapter of the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. I want to finish my racing book first, but after that I really want to help people, and I want that to be the main thing I'm doing. I have more than enough people to shoot the shit with about unimportant topics online whenever I want to, but I lack connections that may help me in my actual material existence. And I think both of those are the case for a lot of people my age. But where do people meet people in my age range now? While this has certainly diminished over the years, there seems to be a lot of support for community groups for young people, like teen meeting places, and for older people, senior citizens, but almost nothing for people older than college and younger than 65 years old. Just empty, naked consumerism. If there are any groups for people in middle age, they tend to be just player social groups, and that's not what I'm looking for. I joined a group of autistics in Syracuse with a lot of kids who were younger than me, but it was mostly just a play group. People hung out, played with blocks, played laser tag. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but I was looking for a support group and nothing seems to exist. If you are autistic and aren't a child, there seems to be nowhere to connect except various play groups, and play groups just didn't make me happy. Scrabble tournaments made me miserable. I find that I'm simultaneously smart enough to hang out in intellectual circles, but too unsophisticated and uncultured to hang with those people, both because I have shallow tastes and because I have a lot of old-fashioned values. I was the kind of person who, when I was a kid, I was anti-file sharing and anti-hacking, and as a result, I never learned much about the seedier sides of the internet, which now unfortunately rule over everything. And that's why I became unemployable as like a programmer too, because it seems like most of the people in my age who became programmers were the cultural rebels who taught themselves stuff by themselves by hacking and hanging out in IRC and all those edgy places that I didn't even know about. I was the kind of person who was afraid of going to chat rooms as a kid because of stranger danger and child predators and so on. And those were common concerns in the 90s, but it seems like the people who rebelled against that are the people who won in culture, and they're increasingly people I want nothing to do with. I find myself in this dead zone where I'm too weird to hang out with the normies, and too square and unrebellious to hang out with the weirdos, too left-wing economically to hang with the boomers, but too right-wing culturally to hang out with my most obvious peers about everything except social justice issues. I don't support racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on, obviously, but I find myself getting reactionary about almost everything else in culture these days. Against postmodernism, irony, edginess, memes, phones, tech, hedonism, scientism, consumerism, rebellion, sex negative. No, I'm not a Trump supporter. He's not even a conservative. He's a right-wing liberal, which is worse. And if you look at all the stuff I hate, most of it is exactly what he embraces. I do fear that I'm becoming whatever the millennial equivalent of a neocon is, and that I would be sorely tempted if the Republicans ever supported national health care and or loan forgiveness. Thankfully, I know that is never going to happen. I hate how technology has isolated us and made us afraid of each other in ways we weren't a couple decades ago, and I wish I could have the kind of connections people had in the 90s and people who grew up before then still do. This probably doesn't even exist anymore for younger kids, since even if people went out and did stuff with each other, everybody would just whip their phones out and would be afraid to make deep and genuine connections with others, and that is what I so deeply crave. A few weeks ago, I went to confession for the first time in 30 years. I grew up Catholic and was questionably devout. I did have first penance and communion when I was 8. I rarely actually went to Mass, but I did watch religiously for almost my entire childhood, prayed and read the New Testament every night. I never read most of the Old Testament, but I've been slowly reading all the books I didn't read lately. Even though I imagine most people I'm in contact with thought I was nice, I never felt that way myself and am constantly racked with regrets. Not so much about my lack of career success, that's just a matter of time, place, generation, and autism, but the fact that I seem to have alienated or become estranged from almost everybody I've ever met. Contrary to most nerds, I was lucky in high school, and I did almost always have some close friends back then. Closer, I think, than any of the friends I have now, but I feel like I've somehow alienated everyone I've ever met over the years. I have an extremely long memory for all the times I hurt other people, and a short memory for the times other people hurt me, which leads to a lot of darkness and self-loathing and nihilism. Although I fight the nihilism hard. I still obsess constantly over my sins from 20 or 25 years ago, and I wondered if confessing them would help. I think it might have. Of course, in this environment, I know probably 80 to 90% of my successful peer friends probably believe the measure of one's religiosity is also the measure of one's stupidity. But I think even most atheists would agree that secular culture has found no replacement for the community religion used to provide. Nobody increasingly feels any obligation to do anything or go anywhere, so they just stay in their little cocoons consuming things. Knickknacks for the boomers, content for the millennials, and cryptocurrency and or gaming experiences for the zoomers. People still want to chit chat and hang out, but fewer and fewer people actually want to help each other with their physical needs in their lives at an exact time when our leaders generally believe any sort of welfare state is communism. And yes, I know there are tons of secular people who still do charity works, but I imagine that's declined to the same degree everything else has, as discussed in Putnam's book. I guess I was always a trad leftist, economically left, socially conservative, the political affiliation that has taken more losses than any other, as the right libertarians entirely won, even though almost nobody outside the elite is actually a libertarian. I had a miserable time at Cornell because I guess it was a breeding ground for those sorts of elites. I mean, Cornell counts as its alumni Keith Olbermann and Ann Coulter and Bill Maher, who are three of like the most toxic political pundits of the last 20 years. Even while on campus, I was sick of the culture of irony and snarkiness, and even by the middle of my freshman year, it was utterly apparent I was a total reject, trailer trash crashing the Ivy League. So I rebelled by getting confirmed in the Catholic Church in 2005, and also by getting back into auto racing. I had stopped watching almost entirely in 2003, having realized how uncool it was, before eventually embracing how uncool I am, and I guess it made me a little happier. I went to Mass regularly my junior year at Cornell, but then kind of stopped going after that. I didn't really find the connections I wanted there either. Obviously, millennials and Zoomers abandoned religion, and I get why. When Joe Sabia, who was the editor of the conservative Cornell Review, writes columns like Tax Gay Sex and A Vote for Bush is a Vote for God in the Cornell Daily Sun, and when Bush himself said, God told me to invade Iraq, I don't blame people for growing up to believe religion is stupid. Those people were assholes. But it's always the loudest and most obnoxious people in every demographic who create the most noise and make it hard for the casual hoi polloi in any community. I realize people wanted to reject the bigotry a lot of religious people had, and I get it and I agree. But now, as everybody wants to smite their enemies, it seems like those people have all evolved to completely want to erase any public displays of spirituality, which is also offensive. Nobody is actually tolerant. They're only tolerant for their own tribe, and that goes for liberals, conservatives, libertarians, centrists, dirtbag leftists, woke leftists, doesn't matter. It feels like none of those groups are actually tolerant for anybody except themselves. Maybe I'm even just a cultural centrist, but compared with so much of what I read online, I feel like a reactionary. I'm not sure whether I even want to go to Mass, but I do think I want to check out the new youth group at my church for 20 to 40-year-olds, but I'm probably already too old for even that. So where do middle-aged people my age find earnest real-world connections with people who want to help each other in the important aspects of their physical lives? We all have tons of people to talk to about mindless things, but nobody to help with the more important things in life. Driving people to doctor's appointments, talking about deep emotional needs, people to help with repairs or household tasks, people to ask for nutrition advice, even people to give things away to, something I desperately want. Even all those things have been outsourced and corporatized. I've recently found out that you can actually buy companions. There are sites where you can just buy friends to hang out with, and that is so freaking sad to me. It's not something I'd ever do, but it's just sad that it exists, and I get why it exists. I get the aching loneliness everybody has because I feel it myself. I realize how I lost contact with everyone I was closer with, and I regret it, and almost everything I posted on Facebook doesn't even get likes from people I knew or once knew in real life. I know it's not entirely my fault. Almost all the apparatuses that most of us normie nerds used to talk to people have been erased from history. F Facebook for killing AOL Instant Messenger, which was the one and only suitable online substitute for phone calls. As my health rapidly deteriorates, I'm so paranoid that I'm either going to die alone or leave my mom completely alone and unable to fend. No, I'm not an incel, even though I probably sound like one. I don't actually want to have sex, but I do desperately desire companionship in the real world after seeing what people used to have that has since been lost. Even if maybe I never had true companions myself, since I mainly talked to school classmates on AOL Instant Messenger and didn't really talk to people in real life. Now that I don't have a job, I don't know what I'm going to do now. I'm getting steadily sicker with seemingly every day due to never resolving my eating disorder, and I guess I do tend to have self-destructive impulses since I rarely exercise, rarely leave the house, originally by choice, but now I'm wanting to choose something different. And I do go to the park a lot of days and ride the swing set exactly 64 times, yes. Snort, snort. I still eat almost entirely junk food. At least I'm not obese and I go to sleep way too late, but I occasionally try to change some of that. I am desperate for someone, anyone I can confide in, anyone who can help me get out of my rut and live what used to be considered a more normal life. I do still want to create a lot of videos on here. That's one of the things I do want to do, but I want to consume things less. I want to read other people's content less and focus on making more of my own. I do want to make typing videos. I do want to make more Maladroit Millennial videos. I don't consider this one that, but I mean, this particular video essay explains like where my head is and why I've been making those. It's like a midlife crisis. I mean, probably more than half of my life is over. I can't imagine living to 74 with the bowel issues I'm already having, but I'm like deep in a midlife crisis mode, even though probably more than half my life is over, and I'm just totally lost in almost every regard in my life. I do still want to write this racing book. I do want to make more typing videos, not videos of me typing, but more instructional videos and historical videos. And I do also want to make other kinds of videos as well, even though they never do well. But above all, I think I want to find the offline people because they are less likely to be infected by the nihilistic mind virus that is the modern internet. Smart people tend to be insufferably smug and proud about how smart they think they are, while dumb people tend to be smug and proud about not being one of the smart ones. I think the average people tend to have the best morals and values, but where are they? How do I find them? I'm sure they're mostly online and the most inclined to talk to each other on the phone, check in to see how each other are doing, and less likely to be consumed by neglect, apathy, and a nihilistic desire to watch the world burn. But that's who I want to be. I would give an unlimited number of IQ points and or words per minute away in exchange for perfect kindness. Unfortunately, I'm better at being smart than I am at being kind.